Hi Booktube, it's me, Sadie, and I am here to talk about the books I read in the month of November, which were all nonfiction, in keeping with the nonfiction November. A little late on my wrap-up, I apologize. It's been a whirlwind of a week. My husband is home. So yay that. And now, the first 3 books I read, I actually left back in Canada because I read them in Canada. So I'm going to try and go through these chronologically as to how I read them. The first one I read is Heartberries by Therese Marie Mailhot. Here is a picture of the cover. I was turned on to it by Rogers Reads and got an advanced copy. It does not come out until February, so I'm not actually going to talk about it very much here because I will be doing a full review of it later on in February, but I will say that if you want to read First Nations Aboriginal stories or stories of women with mental illness, it's a great read. I really enjoyed it, but again, not going to go into it too deep right now just because I will be doing a full-scale review of that when it comes out. The next book I read, which I don't have a picture of, there's a sneezing cat down here. The next book I read was Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, which has been very popular. If I manage to edit, I will put a picture up somewhere in here or in here of the cover if I actually get that far. If not, I think it's fair to say everyone's seen it. That particular book I really enjoyed. I didn't read any of the, I don't read any of the reviews on Goodreads until after I've read something because I don't want it to alter the way I see the book. So when I read it, I found it very informative in how basically everything moving overseas for manufacturing, on top of capitalism winning, on top of, you know, a host of tax problems and poverty, has caused a certain issue with people, particularly white people, in the hillbilly region, where we can see where Trump took over. It's a very interesting look at it from someone who was born into it, raised in it, and escaped it, or rather managed to rise above it. And I don't necessarily think that it's a bad, it's good. It didn't need the last 2 chapters. The last 2 chapters were kind of stupid and useless. I think it wasn't so much an exposition as it was a memoir, and when you try to throw facts at it and make it look like it's a real, like, think piece, where it's not. It's definitely a memoir. It gets kind of muddy, and I didn't like that in the last 2 chapters. You don't need to explain it to me. I've just listened to your story. I'm going to be able to make my own assertions of where this is coming from, as opposed to the last 2 chapters, which are like spoon-feeding you facts, or facts that don't really, like, I mean, it's not the best. It doesn't have a lot in terms of citations. So again, if you're reading it as a memoir, it's a great book. I thought it was great for that purpose. As an expose or an understanding of certain cultures, I don't necessarily know where it sits. There were a lot of responses on Goodreads. Come on up. There were a lot of responses on Goodreads where it was like, well, I'm from the region and I don't have that problem, and this is very degrading to the specific type of people, and yes, my baby, no, we don't go up there. We don't go up there. And I think I think that there's a lot of animosity for some people in those particular regions when people say, no, this is the way it is. Because I can look objectively at the area of Canada I'm from and say that it's the most racist, backwards part of Canada. And I can be okay with that. I can still think, you know, it's okay, but understand what the problems are and what needs to be fixed. I think there's a disconnect for a lot of people where it's like, oh no, we're fine, we did good, we raised ourselves up by the bootstraps. Well, yes, you did, but there is an endemic problem in this area. So it's a good read. That's what it was. That's what it was for me. Then I read Ibificus by Biff Naked. If I get the the pictures up, which I loved. I read it in like a day or two. It's the memoir of the author. It's the memoir of the author. It's the memoir of the musician Biff Naked, who's been around since the 90s. And basically her story, which is very interesting because she was born to Canadians, she was born to Americans and adopted by American missionaries in India, and then moved to America, then moved to Canada. She's now a Canadian. And so I actually knew her father because he worked at the same place as my mom for a brief period of time. He also advised me not to get any tattoos or to pierce myself, so as you can see, I listened to him very seriously. And her life is just kind of like insane, and having been a fan of the music right from the first CD onward, you know, you didn't really know where the songs were coming from, and now I kind of know where they're coming from. And the fact that she takes a licking and keeps on ticking, like, her outlook on life is amazing, because for someone who's been through as much as she has, just to come out on top, you know, be it abusive relationships or sexual trauma, parental divorce at a young age, 2 failed marriages, breast cancer, she just takes a licking and keeps on ticking. She's a very positive person, and I found her book to be really inspiring in some ways, and in others just like, it was really amazing to read. So if you are a fan of Canadian music, or if you want to read about Biff Naked, I recommend it. She's an amazing person, and I really don't have much to add, except that if you do have like if you need a trigger warning for some things, this book has several trigger warnings. But it details her getting into the music business, how that came about, her first marriage, her subsequent abortion, then her second marriage, and how that got televised. It was televised. It was very interesting. I remember seeing that. It was webisodes, I believe. And so, again, I rated it really high. I don't really want to get into the rating system of Goodreads, or how there's reader fatigue, etc. I just pick up a different genre and keep going if that happens, or I stop reading for a little bit because sometimes my head gets tired. But yeah, no, my rating system from 1 to 5 is to show whether or not I think it's something I will reread, or if it's something I would read and recommend, or if it's something that totally sucks. A 3 is the middle ground, it's the middle of the road, it's a good solid thing, but it's neither here nor there. A 4 is something I would recommend, and a 5 is something I would recommend with ferocity. A 2 or a 1, and it's basically, why did I finish this? Because I wasn't letting the book win. I hate DNFing, so I very rarely do it, but there you have it. Then next up, I'm the idiot who didn't bring a drink in here. This might actually get done pretty quickly. Next up, I read A House in the Sky by Amanda Lynn Hout and Sarah Corbett. It was a #1 bestseller in Canada. I picked it up in Canada. It's also on New York Times Book Review, Notable Book of the Year. It's the Globe and Mail Best Book. It's got a blurb by Jeanette Wall, and so how did I feel about this book? I found the part where she was, basically, this is the story of Amanda Lynn Hout and her it's a travelogue for the most part in the first half, and then she gets into a job where she's doing some reporting for foreign media, and subsequently that leads to her getting kidnapped and held for over 100 days, 190 some days, in Mogadishu, Somalia. And so the first half, the travelogue, deals more with her going on her first trip, deciding she wants to travel, spending her life waitressing so she can make money to go traveling, and basically how she got from point A to point B and what she did when she got to point B, and the people she met along the way, which is all fine. It would have worked well as a travelogue. I felt it was disjointed when we get into the part where she is currently, so she's been through Bangladesh, she's been through Afghanistan and Iran, etc., And now she's going to Somalia to do a report, some sort of reporting, and subsequently she gets kidnapped with a photographer. They both get kidnapped. Now, that part and the rest of it could have been left into a different book. This is essentially 2 books, because I don't feel that the travelogue is important to the fact that she was kidnapped. And the kidnapping and how she dealt with the kidnapping and subsequently converting to Islam to try and garner some sort of respect from her kidnappers or to get an upper hand didn't really play out the way she wanted. Essentially, eventually, she was negotiated for and released. And through this, and then we learn the backstory of her parents and what her parents had gone through, as well as the parents of the photographer, and how she and the photographer could never actually come to grips with their relationship after the fact, after being contained that long together. So, 2 different good books in one. I would say that I prefer the abduction part. The travelogue reads a little like, I was a waitress and this is how I made great tips, and then I went here and we did this, and then I went back and I waitressed some more so that we could do 4 months over here, and then I did this, and then I went back and I waitressed at this other place while I was staying with some person, which of course would make Steve very happy because he enjoys that when the money is actually discussed, which is, you know, in and of itself. I know people who've done this, and that this is very familiar, particularly in Canada. This woman being from Red Deer, and she moved to Calgary, etc. So she's from Alberta, so I know it's a big thing for people in their like late teens, early 20s to do this. I have several friends who've done it. It's not that bizarre to me that someone would waitress, make a shit ton of money, save it, and then go travel for a couple months, then come back and do the same thing. I guess that part was just too boring for me for such a big book, but the last half was good. So there you have it. Then I read American Fire, Love, Arson, and Life in a Vanishing Land by Monica Hess, which was a book of the month in July. And I love true crime, and I was really feeling it, and I really wanted it to be good, and it just wasn't. It just wasn't. Originally, this was written as a newspaper article, and I bet the newspaper article was awesome. But the book itself is too small. It's not fleshed out. There's not a lot of notation. There's not a lot of there's no explanation as to where things come from, except to say I lived there and I talked to people. And that's not good enough for me. I want some expository notes. I would like to know more about things. The whole love story between Tanya and Charlie, and how Tanya had 2 children previously from a black man. I don't really understand why that has to be stated so proudly and prevalently. Like, who cares? She had 2 previous children. We don't hear Tanya's side at any point because Tanya declined to be a part of the making of this book. We hear a lot about Charlie and his whole thing, and he comes to blame it on Tanya and impotence and inability to get it up. But, and that's referenced in the very beginning as to why they go to counseling and why they go to church and things to get help with the thing. The thing isn't explained to you till halfway through, when he finally confesses, when he's been caught, that he can't get it up, and that's why they started lighting fires, because that made her happy. Well, okay, it just pissed me off in the beginning when they were talking about the thing. She actually calls it the thing. And I'm like, did I miss something? Was there mention of the thing? Like, I started going back and I was like, no, I read this. Like, I should know this. We get a lot of discussion about volunteer firefighters and their various ways and methods of dealing with things and how they look at different fires, which was very interesting. But all in all, unless you really care, don't bother. It's going in the pile to go away. I know a lot of people really liked it and thought it was riveting, but it just wasn't for me. I want more. I want more out of a true crime that I didn't get there. And the last thing I finished, I actually finished in December, but I read most of it in November, and quite frankly, it was part of my nonfiction November plans, so I'm counting it in with November, and that's As You Wish, Inconceivable Tales from the Making of the Princess Bride by Carrie Elwes with Joe Layden, and a foreword by Rob Reiner, which I found hardcover at the Goodwill, and I am so glad I did. I love The Princess Bride. I could quote The Princess Bride. I'm an Andre the Giant fanatic, as some of you may know, some of you may not know. So they were great stories, just great tidbits from on the scenes with pictures. There's interjections by all, like, the various casts. There's Rob Reiner, Mandy Patinkin, Fred Savage, William Goldman, who wrote the novel, Chris Rand. Pretty much everybody who's still alive is in this book, and I appreciated that a lot. It was just a great read. So if you are a big old fan of The Princess Bride, you want to know more of the backstory and interesting tidbits as to how it got made, and the cast interactions and everything, I think As You Wish would be a great read. I gave it 5 stars, completely because if you've ever watched and loved The Princess Bride, you need to read this book, period. And that was everything I read in November, which all in all isn't that bad. So December, my big plan is to try and finish War and Peace. I have a couple of other things I want to read, a couple of the things I've started reading, and yeah, I guess I will be filming my November haul video, or maybe I'll wait until December. I don't know. We went to a used bookstore, so, you know, there's a stack right there. But, yeah, that's everything I've got so far for November. I hope you had a great nonfiction November, and I'll see you again for the December wrap-up.